Are you making the mistake of assuming that you're hitting the speaking and listening standards in your class every single time your students participate in a class discussion? I'm willing to bet that not a ton of time is spent intentionally addressing the nuances of the speaking and listening standards, because it's hard, because we also want to be able to help students master them. So I'm going to walk you through a fun activity that will have your students truly practicing the speaking and listening standards, and it's going to set them up for success with future class discussions. That way you will actually be checking off those speaking and listening standards every single time they participate. But before I dive in, make sure to hit subscribe for more videos like this. Okay, let's dive in. The speaking and listening standards, when broken down, require students to do the following: engage effectively in collaborative discussions, refer to relevant evidence, identify claims and arguments and evaluate their effectiveness with the evidence presented, pose questions that connect the ideas of different speakers, justify their own views, and analyze the purpose of the information being presented. And so again, ask yourself this question: each time you have a class discussion, are students naturally and effectively doing those things? So if you want to help your students improve these speaking and listening skills, using podcasts in your lessons is a super low prep option that's also going to engage your students and provide them with focused practice on improving their speaking and listening. So once you have students participate in a podcast analysis activity or two, you can then refer to what they learn from this experience during future class discussions. And the beauty of finding the right podcast to use with students is that the audio also allows them to create a visual of the topic in their minds. And then the unique voices that students hear adds depth and helps them create connections. So let's walk through some basic steps to get started for trying a podcast analysis activity in your own classroom. So there are 5 steps and it's super simple. Step number 1 is you want to find an engaging, appropriate podcast episode to play in your classroom, right? There are so many options available, but if you want to get started right away, 2 podcasts that are guaranteed to hook your students are Criminal and This Is Love, and both are hosted by Phoebe Judge. So on the Criminal podcast, there are 3 episodes that are appropriate and that we've witnessed a ton of success with from our EB teachers using these in their own classrooms. So number 1 is episode 142 called Robert Smalls. And in 1862, Robert Smalls takes over a Confederate ship and frees his family from enslavement. This is an absolutely fascinating account. Episode 160 is called Hot Lotto. And here a person buys a winning $16.5 million lottery ticket in Iowa, but then doesn't show up to collect his winnings. So things start to get stranger and stranger as investigators get involved in what turns out to be the biggest lottery fraud in US history. And I want to note that this one has 2 minor swear words, but they're super easy to skip if you need to. Episode 185 is called The Princess, and in this one, a mysterious woman just appears in an English village and no one can figure out who the heck she is. Okay, so those are those ones. And then one episode on This Is Love that we love is episode 55, and this is called The Rescue. And George shares how he found himself badly injured and stuck at the bottom of a cave after falling more than 2 stories. So remember, whatever you're going to use, you want to preview the episode that you're going to choose, make sure it's appropriate for your students. Side note, but super important. All right, step number 2 is you want to come up with 5 to 10 questions that students can answer as they listen to the episode. And this is incredibly helpful because it requires students to pay close attention. And after listening, they now have focused notes on the episode's highlights. So when you listen to the episode in class, I want you to often pause, allow students time to answer the questions. We're not just listening and moving, we're pausing and being reflective on it. So going back to the Hot Lotto episode I mentioned, I want to give you some examples of what some questions might look like for students to get your brain and wheels turning. So a question might be something like to sketch an image of the person who bought the lotto ticket based on the description in the video or in the podcast. Number 2, pause and list your ideas. Why might this lotto winner have been so secretive? Or number 3, given all the red flags that the perpetrator displayed, why do you think his friend Ed never suspected him until he saw the video? And number 4, once you think you've discovered the prime suspect, write the suspect's name in a box. And as you listen, write down any clues that you hear that point to him as the perpetrator of the crime. So with those questions, notice that these questions have students summarizing, synthesizing, analyzing the information that they're hearing from this episode. All right, step number 3 is print out the transcript of the episode. A ton of podcasts, including both Criminal and This Is Love, have transcripts available for all of their episodes. And it can really benefit students if they read the transcript after listening. That way they can pick up on any details that they might have missed out. They can also jot down additional questions that might come up. And what's really cool is that these transcripts are a super great way to differentiate for your students. It might be helpful for some of your students too, side note, to read through the transcript before listening to the podcast if that is something that is challenging for them, if listening is challenging. Okay, step 4. Now you want to have a focused class discussion using the notes that students took as well as the questions that they came up with as they listened to and read the episode. And this is where you get to be really intentional with those speaking and listening standards. So I recommend writing them on the board as objectives for students so that the discussion expectations are super clear to them and they can monitor if they are meeting those standards. You also want to encourage students to use relevant evidence from the notes that they took and their annotated transcript. So again, I'm going to put the standards on the screen for you. Take a screenshot of this and even project this on your board to just use this with your students. So some additional questions that you can pose for students to help them meet the standards are the following, and this can be used for any podcast. Number 1, what can listeners learn from listening to this podcast? What lessons come from a story like this? Number 2, why do you think the producers of the podcast chose to research and air this particular story? What was their purpose? Was it to entertain, to persuade, to inform? Was it something else? And so whether you do this discussion whole class or small group, ask students to keep a tally mark every time they refer to evidence, pose a thoughtful question, justify their views, etc. So they're really lining up with the standards. All right, step 5, reflect on the lesson. What strategies helped students recall the information from the episode? What made listening difficult? What could they do next time to feel more prepared to engage in the class discussion? And this reflection is super helpful for you as the teacher because now the next time you do it, you get to improve and make little tweaks and changes to make it all that much better. One thing that you always want to make sure to tell your students is that class discussions in your ELA class should always include students sharing evidence, identifying claims, posing questions, justifying their own views, analyzing the purpose of what they read, what they view, what they listen to. Very important to keep that forefront and center for your students. And this activity helps make those objectives concrete, where the whole focus is on practicing those standards in an engaging and unexpected way. So podcasts are so great at the start of the school year to set the tone for discussions. You can also use them whenever you have a class period or two to fill before like a school break or something like that. Perhaps when you're looking to re-engage your students, or even as supplemental activities during a particular ELA unit. It's amazing when you can align a podcast topic to a novel or a short story. That way you can weave in those speaking and listening skills. All right, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Again, make sure that you subscribe for more videos like this.